All right, welcome back to Fantasy Bankroll. I'm your host, Robert Banker. Let's take a look and see who's up and who's down after 2 weeks. It's stock report time. Let's go. All right, let's get started by taking a look at the players whose stock is up after week 2. The first quarterback on my stock up report this week, Detroit Lions quarterback Jared Goff. Goff had a rough week 1, but he had a bounce back in week 2, going 23 of 28 for 334 yards and 5 touchdowns. Now, as a fantasy GM, you love when your quarterback has as many touchdowns as incompletions. And as I mentioned on the waiver wire show yesterday, Goff and the Lions should have a top 10 offense the rest of the year, so I'd expect his stock to stay high. The next quarterback on my stock up report this week, Indianapolis Colts quarterback Daniel Jones. Jones is currently a top 5 scoring quarterback, and he's completing 71.4% of his passes, with 5 total touchdowns and no turnovers through 2 weeks. And as I mentioned on my waiver wire show earlier this week, if you happen to be one of the teams hit with the injury bug at the quarterback position, you should definitely try and grab Jones if you can. The first running back on my stock up report this week, Dallas Cowboys running back Javonte Williams. With 18 carries for 97 yards and 1 touchdown and 6 catches in week 2, he now has 151 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground and 8 receptions on 10 targets for the season. And he's currently a top 5 scoring back in most leagues. The next running back on my stock up report this week, Seattle Seahawks running back Kenneth Walker III. After 10 carries for 20 yards in week 1, Walker looked more like what we're used to in week 2, rushing 13 times for 105 yards and 1 touchdown and adding 1 reception. Now the question is how they're going to handle the split between him and Zach Charbonnet going forward. The first wide receiver on my stock up report this week, Chicago Bears wide receiver Rome Odunze. The year 2 wide receiver saw the volume in week 1 with 9 targets, but was contained by the Vikings to a 6.2 average and 1 touchdown. But in week 2, he caught 7 of 11 targets for 128 yards and 2 touchdowns. And I think he continues to see a high volume on a weekly basis. The next wide receiver on my stock up report this week, Baltimore Ravens wide receiver Zay Flowers. And Flowers had 7 receptions for 75 yards in week 2, and he's up to 14 catches on 20 targets for the season. And he has a ridiculous, and I'm going to get this number right, 42.6 target share percentage. And both his yards per target and yards per route ran are up from last season. All right, the first tight end on my stock up report this week, Green Bay Packers tight end Tucker Kraft. Now, Kraft had his 2 catches for 16-yard week 1 saved by a touchdown. But in week 2, he caught 6 of 7 passes for 124 yards and a touchdown. And he's currently rocking a 22.4 target share percentage. All right, the last tight end and player on my stock up report this week, Washington Commanders tight end Zach Ertz. Now, if you saw my waiver wire show earlier in the week, I mentioned how I thought last year was going to be a 1-year resurgence for Ertz before he inevitably fell off the cliff this year. But I have to say I was wrong, and through 2 weeks, he leads the Commanders in every receiving category with 9 catches for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he currently has an 18.8 target share percentage, so he's getting a lot of the looks as well. Keep it up, old man. All right, now let's look at some of those players whose stock is down after week 2. Let's go. The first quarterback on my stock down report this week, Minnesota Vikings quarterback J.J. McCarthy. Now, after McCarthy's dream heroics in week 1, in which he led a 21-point fourth quarter comeback, week 2 was more like a nightmare. He went 11 of 21 for 158 yards and 2 interceptions. Add in the fact that he ended up getting injured, and it was clearly a bad week for the Viking signal caller. The next quarterback on my stock down report this week, Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes. Now, Mahomes is on my list this week strictly based on who he's been in the past. And it's not like he's not having a good season. He's top 10 in fantasy scoring. But this is a new Mahomes in the fantasy realm. For the season, he's 40 of 68 for 445 yards with 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. And the old Mahomes has had single games with better numbers than that. And that's why Mahomes is on my stock down report this week. All right, the first running back on the stock down report this week, New York Giants running back Tyrone Tracy. Now, Tracy only had 5 carries for 15 yards in week 2. And for the season, he's at 15 carries for 39 yards and a big touchdowns. And to make matters worse, rookie running back Cam Scatterbo out-touched Tracy by 4 touches in week 2. And that's not what fantasy GMs want to see. All right, the next running back on my stock down report this week, and it pains me to say this, Cincinnati Bengals running back Chase Brown. Now, the good news is Brown's getting the touches, averaging 21 per game through the first 2 weeks. The bad news is he's only turned that into 37 carries for 90 yards and 1 touchdown. And his 2.4 yards per carry average ranks 46th among qualified running backs. But where it's really been a disappointment fantasy-wise for fantasy GMs is in the receiving department, where he has 4 catches for 26 yards on the season, which was below his per-game average last season. Now, the good news for fantasy GMs is I think the Bengals are going to want to keep feeding Brown to keep the pressure off new quarterback Jake Browning. So I could definitely see his stock going back up. All right, the first wide receiver on my stock down report this week, Denver Broncos wide receiver Cortland Sutton. Now, after a pretty good week 1 in which he had 6 catches for 61 yards and 1 touchdown, he had the complete opposite week 2, catching 1 pass for 6 yards on 4 targets. And as a fantasy GM, those are the type of fluctuations you can't have on a weekly basis. All right, the last wide receiver on my stock down report this week, Jacksonville Jaguars wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. Now, after an outstanding rookie season, expectations were high for Thomas Jr. going into year 2. But through 2 weeks, he only has 5 catches for 60 yards and no touchdowns. And he still is top 20 in target share, but as someone who was drafted as a wide receiver 1, fantasy GMs need him to turn it around ASAP. The first tight end on my stock down report this week, Baltimore Ravens tight end Mark Andrews. Now, I don't mean to pile on after Andrews was on my list last week, but after 1 catch for 2 yards in week 2, he's now up to a whopping 2 catches for 7 yards on the season. And he looks like a shell of the former player who's been a top 5 finisher in fantasy the last 4 seasons. And with Isaiah Likely returning soon, it's time for fantasy GMs to think about benching or even dropping Andrews. All right, the last tight end and last player on my stock down report this week, New England Patriots tight end Hunter Henry. Now, Henry was a big waiver wire ad after his 4-catch, 66-yard week 1. But in week 2, he only had 1 catch for 9 yards against the Dolphins. And while I don't expect that on a weekly basis from him, as a fantasy GM, you can't have players who disappear for some games. All right, that'll do it for the Week 2 stock report on Fantasy Bankroll. Thank you so much for checking it out. Let me know if you think any of the stock down players are going to have bounce back Week 3s. Let me know who's been a disappointment for your fantasy team through 2 weeks of the season. And don't forget to check back later in the week when I'll have my bearish and bullish list on players that I'm targeting and players I'm avoiding for Week 3 in fantasy. Let's go!